My name is Jason, and I'm 38 years old. For the past 12 years, I've been married to my wife, Emily. From the outside, people might say we had a good life. We both had steady careers, Emily as a corporate recruiter and me as a graphic designer. We owned a modest home in the suburbs, shared a love for travel, and had plenty of happy memories together. But over the last couple of years, something had shifted between us. It wasn't one big event that caused the change, it was more like a gradual drift, the kind you don't notice until it's too far to ignore. Conversations that once flowed easily had turned into awkward silences. Our evenings together became routines of sitting in separate rooms, scrolling through our phones instead of connecting. At first, I thought it was just the stress of life. Emily's job was demanding, she spent long hours screening candidates, negotiating salaries, and managing teams. My work as a freelance designer wasn't any easier, juggling deadlines and client demands left me drained most days. But the excuses I kept telling myself, that it was just a phase, that we were both too busy, started wearing thin. The tipping point came one night during an argument. I can't even remember what started it, but it ended with Emily snapping, "Maybe we just don't work anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The woman I'd shared my life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, was questioning our very foundation. After that, I knew we couldn't keep sweeping things under the rug. I suggested couples therapy, a neutral space where we could work through whatever was pulling us apart. Emily hesitated at first, but eventually, she agreed. "We'll try it," she said, her tone reluctant. "But I don't think we need it. We just have to communicate better." Her response gave me hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe therapy would give us the tools to reconnect and rebuild what we'd lost. Our first session was promising. The therapist, Dr. Carter, was a kind, middle-aged woman with a calming presence. She encouraged us to talk openly about our feelings and frustrations, and for the first time in months, it felt like Emily and I were on the same page. But that optimism didn't last. The second session was cancelled by Emily at the last minute. "Work emergency," she'd said, brushing it off. The third session never happened because she claimed she wasn't feeling well. By the time the fourth appointment rolled around, she cancelled again, saying she was too exhausted after a long week. Her excuses started piling up, and I couldn't ignore the pattern. Every time I brought it up, she'd shrug and say something like, "We're fine. We don't need a therapist to tell us how to talk to each other." But we weren't fine. The distance between us grew, and I felt like I was the only one trying to make things work. Emily seemed to have checked out entirely. Her reluctance to commit to therapy didn't just feel like avoidance, it felt like she didn't care enough to try. I told myself not to overreact, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Something she wasn't telling me. At first, I chalked Emily's resistance to therapy up to stress. Her job had always been demanding, and she'd been putting in longer hours than usual lately. I figured she was just overwhelmed and didn't have the emotional bandwidth for deep conversations about our relationship. But as the weeks went on, her behavior started to change in ways I couldn't ignore. She'd always been organized to a fault, but now her schedule seemed more chaotic than ever. She'd come home later than usual, claiming she'd been stuck in meetings or dealing with last-minute emergencies. When I asked for specifics, her answers were vague. "It's just work," she'd say with a tired sigh. "You wouldn't understand how crazy it's been lately." At first, I took her at her word. Corporate recruiting wasn't exactly in my wheelhouse, and I knew her company had been struggling to fill some high-level positions. But then there were the phone calls. Emily started taking calls at odd hours, late at night, early in the morning, even on weekends. She'd step out of the room when her phone rang, lowering her voice to a near whisper as she spoke. When I asked who it was, she always had an explanation ready. "Just a candidate I'm working with. An urgent call from HR. Client issues." It's nothing. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Then there was her phone itself. Emily had never been particularly private about her devices before, but lately, she seemed glued to it. She'd hold it close, angling the screen away whenever I walked by. Notifications would light up her screen, and she'd quickly swipe them away before I could see. One evening, as we were watching TV, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it immediately, her body tense as she read the message. I caught a glimpse of the name Megan before she locked the screen. "Who's Megan?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "A coworker," she said without missing a beat. "She's new. I've been helping her get settled." I wanted to believe her, but the way she avoided looking at me made my stomach twist. The cancellation started bothering me more, too. I'd scheduled another therapy session after her string of excuses, but on the day of the appointment, she texted me from work to say she couldn't make it. "I'm swamped," the message read. "Rain check?" I stared at the text for a long time before replying. It wasn't just about therapy anymore. It was about the growing distance between us, the feeling that Emily was slipping further and further away. That night, I brought it up again. "Emily, we need to talk," I said as we sat down for dinner. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth, and she gave me a wary look. "About what?" "About us. About therapy." She sighed and set her fork down. "Mark, I told you, I've just been too busy. It's not that I don't care. I do. I just think we can handle this ourselves, without dragging some stranger into it." Her words sounded reasonable enough, but they didn't match her actions. If she truly cared, why did she keep avoiding the sessions? Why did she seem more focused on her phone than on saving our marriage? "I don't think we are handling it," I said quietly. "We're barely talking. I feel like you're shutting me out." She looked at me, her expression softening. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she shook her head and smiled faintly. "You're overthinking it," she said. "We're fine, Mark." "Really?" But we weren't fine. Her reassurances felt hollow, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. And as much as I wanted to believe her, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me that something was off. The cracks in our marriage were growing wider, and I was starting to wonder if Emily's reluctance to face them was about more than just stress or work. I didn't have proof, not yet, but my gut was telling me there was more to this story. And I was determined to find out what it was. The uneasy feeling in my gut refused to go away. The more I thought about Emily's behavior, the more the little inconsistencies piled up in my mind. The late nights at work, the secretive phone calls, the sudden resistance to therapy, it all added up to a picture I didn't want to see. I started paying closer attention. Not in an obvious way, I didn't want to accuse her of anything without evidence, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Every time her phone buzzed, my ears perked up. Every time she left the room to take a call, my stomach churned. One Friday night, Emily announced she had to work late again. She barely touched the dinner I'd made before grabbing her laptop bag and heading out the door. "There's a huge presentation on Monday," she explained, kissing me on the cheek. "I'll probably be home late. Don't wait up." I nodded, trying to seem understanding, but something about her tone felt rehearsed, like she'd said those exact words before. That night, as I sat alone on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Normally, when Emily worked late, she'd send me a quick text during her break or call to check in. But hours passed, and my phone stayed silent. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I opened my laptop and logged into the tracking app we'd installed years ago to keep tabs on each other's phones. At the time, it had been more about convenience than anything else, making sure we could find each other during emergencies or if one of us lost our phone. Now, I felt a pang of guilt as I stared at the map on my screen. Her location pinged at a restaurant downtown, nowhere near her office. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she'd finished work early and decided to grab a late dinner. Maybe she was meeting a coworker to go over the presentation. But no matter how many excuses I made, none of them felt convincing. The next morning, I decided to check her car for any clues. I wasn't proud of myself, it felt invasive and wrong, but I needed answers. At first, I didn't find anything unusual. But then, tucked under the passenger seat, I found a receipt from the restaurant she'd been at the night before. It wasn't just for one person. The receipt listed 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and dessert. And at the bottom, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't hers, was a note. "Great seeing you tonight. Let's do this again soon." My hands trembled as I stared at the receipt. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and they painted a picture I didn't want to believe. Later that day, Emily was out running errands, and I decided to dig deeper. I hated myself for it, but I opened her laptop. She'd always been terrible about logging out of her email, and sure enough, her inbox was still open. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were dozens of messages between her and someone named Megan. Only, Megan wasn't a coworker. Megan didn't exist. The emails were from a man named Tyler, and their content left no room for interpretation. They'd been meeting for weeks, dinners, drinks, even a weekend trip she'd claimed was a work retreat. Tyler's messages were flirtatious, romantic, and intimate. And Emily's replies were just as damning. "I miss you already," one of her messages read. "Can't wait to see you again." My world came crashing down. The woman I'd trusted, the person I'd built a life with, had been lying to me for months. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence, trying to process what I'd just discovered. My mind raced with questions. How long has this been going on? Was I blind to it the whole time? Why didn't she just tell me if she was unhappy? But most of all, I felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Emily's resistance to therapy suddenly made sense. It wasn't just about avoiding uncomfortable conversations. She didn't want a therapist to dig too deeply and uncover the truth she'd been hiding. That evening, I couldn't look at her without feeling a wave of anger and sadness. She didn't seem to notice my distant demeanor, or if she did, she didn't comment on it. I spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I'd let things get to this point. Emily had made her choices, but now it was my turn to decide how to respond. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to figure out how to confront Emily. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal, but the thought of actually having the conversation filled me with dread. How do you even begin to address something that completely shatters the foundation of your marriage? I waited until a quiet evening when neither of us had plans. Emily was sitting at the dining table with her laptop, working on something for her job, or so she claimed. I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering my thoughts, before finally stepping into the room. "Emily," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She looked up, surprised. "What's wrong?" I pulled out the receipt I'd found in her car and set it on the table in front of her. Her eyes darted to the paper, and I saw the color drain from her face. "What is this?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She stared at the receipt like it was a ticking time bomb, her hands trembling slightly. It's just a dinner," she said, her voice unsteady. "With who?" I pressed. She hesitated, then let out a shaky sigh. "A friend from work." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "Don't lie to me, Emily. I know it wasn't a coworker. I've seen the emails. I know about Tyler." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a defeated breath. "How did you find out?" she asked quietly. That doesn't matter, I said, my voice cold. What matters is that you've been lying to me for months. Why, Emily? Why would you do this? She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled as she spoke. I don't know. I wasn't planning for it to happen. It started with work events, and then we started talking more, and, she trailed off, unable to finish. You weren't planning for it to happen? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been sneaking around behind my back, canceling therapy sessions, lying to my face, and you call that unplanned? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. I never meant to hurt you, Jason. I swear. I felt so lost. So disconnected from everything. And Tyler made me feel seen. He made me feel like I mattered. Her words cut deep, like a knife twisting in my gut. You didn't think you mattered to me? I asked, my voice cracking. 12 years of marriage, and you couldn't talk to me about how you were feeling? You thought the answer was to go behind my back and have an affair? She sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. I know I messed up. I know I ruined everything. But I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want you to hate me. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. Because now I don't know what to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Sadness? Take your pick, Emily, because that's what you've left me with. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. I could tell she wanted to say more, to explain herself, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Finally, she broke the silence. I'll end it, she said, her voice trembling. I'll block Tyler, delete his number, whatever it takes. I'll go to therapy, I'll do anything to fix this. Just, please, Jason. Don't give up on us. Her words sounded desperate, but I couldn't ignore the lingering bitterness in my chest. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her a chance to make things right. But another part, the part that felt betrayed and shattered, wasn't sure if that was even possible. I need time, I said finally, my voice hollow. I don't know if I can do this right now. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. Take all the time you need. Just, please don't shut me out completely. I stood up and left the room, retreating to the spare bedroom where I'd been sleeping for the past few nights. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage had reached a crossroads. The question now was whether it was worth trying to salvage, or if it was already too late. The days following Emily's confession were a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I tried to focus on work, pouring myself into my graphic design projects, but the thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. Every time I sat down to create something, my mind wandered back to her words, he made me feel like I mattered. I kept asking myself the same questions. When did I stop making her feel that way? Was there something I missed? Did I push her to this without realizing it? The rational part of me knew this wasn't my fault. She could have talked to me, told me how she was feeling, or fought for our marriage instead of turning to someone else. But no matter how much I tried to remind myself of that, the guilt still gnawed at me. Emily tried to reach out several times over the next week, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to have another conversation, let alone decide what our next steps would be. I spent most of my time in the spare bedroom, avoiding her as much as possible. She left notes for me, on the kitchen counter, on my nightstand, even in my laptop bag. They all said the same things: I'm sorry. I love you. Please don't give up on us. I read them, but I didn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. One evening, I decided to go for a drive. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in on me, and I needed some air. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just drove, letting the quiet hum of the engine drown out the noise in my head. Eventually, I ended up at the park where Emily and I used to take walks when we first got married. It was one of our favorite spots back then, a place where we could escape the stress of our jobs and just enjoy each other's company. Sitting on a bench, I stared out at the lake, the water reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. I thought about the early years of our marriage, how happy we'd been, how sure I was that we'd grow old together. I wondered if it was still possible to get back to that place, or if those days were gone for good. By the time I got home, it was late. The house was dark except for a light in the living room, where Emily was sitting on the couch, waiting for me. She looked up as I walked in, her face tired and puffy from crying. "Jason," she said softly, standing up. "I'm sorry if I've been pushing too hard. I don't know what to do anymore. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw just how broken she looked. It was a strange feeling, seeing her pain and realizing I wasn't the only one suffering. But that didn't change the fact that she'd caused this. "I told you I need time," I said, my voice even. "You can't rush this, Emily. I'm not even sure if I want to try to fix this. I don't know if I can." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand. I'll give you space. But please, don't shut me out completely." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I went upstairs and closed the door behind me, the weight of her words pressing down on me. That night, I lay awake for hours, my thoughts a jumbled mess of memories and questions. Part of me wanted to believe that we could get through this, that therapy and time could heal the wounds she'd caused. But another part, the part that felt like a stranger in my own marriage, wasn't so sure. What I did know was that I couldn't keep living in limbo. Sooner or later, I'd have to make a choice. The only problem was, I didn't know what the right choice was anymore. After a week of avoiding any meaningful interaction with Emily, I realized that the avoidance itself was slowly eating away at me. The silence in our home felt suffocating, a constant reminder of everything that had been broken. I couldn't stay in limbo forever. I needed answers, not just about her actions but about the deeper issues in our marriage that had led us to this point. One evening, after dinner, if you could call the quiet, uncomfortable meal we'd shared a dinner, I finally broke the silence. "Emily," I said, setting my fork down and looking directly at her. "We need to talk. Really talk." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Okay." We moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The distance between us felt symbolic, a physical representation of the emotional chasm that had formed over the past few months. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Why did you resist therapy so much?" I asked. "Was it because of Tyler? Because you didn't want me, or a therapist, to figure out what was going on?" She hesitated, biting her lip as if searching for the right words. "At first, no," she admitted. "When you suggested therapy, I agreed because I thought it could help. But then Tyler happened, and everything got so complicated. I knew if we went to therapy, it would come out eventually. And I wasn't ready to face that, not with you, and not with myself." Her honesty stung, but at least it was something. "So instead of working on our marriage, you decided to bury your head in the sand?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She winced. "I know how it sounds, Jason. But I was scared. Scared of losing you, scared of admitting how far we'd drifted apart. Tyler he was a distraction, a way to escape how unhappy I felt." "Unhappy?" I repeated, my voice rising. "And you thought an affair was the solution? Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? How much trust you've shattered?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't done. "You could have talked to me, Emily," I said, my voice breaking. "You could have told me you were unhappy, that you felt disconnected. We could have worked on it together. Instead, you chose to lie, to sneak around, to betray me in the worst way possible." She sobbed quietly, her head in her hands. "You're right," she said, her voice muffled. "I should have talked to you. I should have handled it differently. But I didn't, and now I've ruined everything." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling between us. "Do you even want to save this marriage?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Yes," she said firmly. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I love you, Jason. I always have. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Her words sounded sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough anymore. I needed more than promises and apologies. I needed actions, proof that she was committed to rebuilding the trust she'd destroyed. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can look at you the same way again. But if we're going to try, you need to cut all ties with Tyler. Completely. No messages, no calls, no chance encounters. Nothing." "I already have," she said quickly. "I blocked his number, deleted everything. He's out of my life. I swear." I nodded, though a part of me still doubted her. "If we do this, I'm not promising anything. This is going to take time. And you're going to have to earn back my trust every single day." "I will," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever it takes, Jason. I'll do it." The conversation ended there, both of us emotionally drained. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could see a glimmer of clarity in the chaos. But deep down, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness might be possible, but forgetting? That was a different story altogether. In the days that followed our confrontation, Emily and I began the tentative process of trying to rebuild what had been shattered. It wasn't like flipping a switch, there were no sudden moments of clarity or instant solutions. Instead, it felt more like trudging through a fog, unsure of where the path would lead. Emily started making changes almost immediately. She deleted Tyler's contact information in front of me, blocked his number, and even offered to show me her phone anytime I wanted. She called Dr. Carter, the therapist we'd originally seen, and rescheduled the session she'd cancelled weeks ago. It all seemed promising on the surface, but I couldn't ignore the lingering doubt in my mind. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight, no matter how many actions or promises are made. Our first therapy session after the fallout was awkward, to say the least. Dr. Carter greeted us warmly, but the tension between Emily and me was palpable. "I'm glad you both decided to come back," Dr. Carter said, her tone calm and encouraging. "I know this has been a challenging time, but the fact that you're both here shows that you're willing to work through it." Emily spoke first, explaining everything she'd done since our last session, cutting ties with Tyler, taking responsibility for her actions, and trying to earn back my trust. She was honest about her mistakes, and though her words were painful to hear, I appreciated her willingness to be open. When it was my turn to speak, I struggled to put my feelings into words. How do you articulate the mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal that comes from discovering your spouse's affair? I told Dr. Carter about the months of suspicion, the evidence I'd found, and the emotional toll it had taken on me. "Part of me wants to move forward," I admitted. "But another part of me doesn't know if I can. Every time I think about what happened, it feels like a knife in my chest." "How do you forgive someone when the hurt runs so deep?" Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Forgiveness is a process," she said. "It's not about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about finding a way to move forward, whether that means rebuilding the relationship or finding closure on your own terms. The key is open communication and setting clear boundaries moving forward." After the session, Emily and I sat in the car in silence. I could tell she wanted to say something, but I wasn't ready for another conversation. The session had stirred up emotions I'd been trying to suppress, and I needed time to process them. In the weeks that followed, we settled into a strange rhythm. Emily threw herself into proving her commitment, sending me text updates during the day, volunteering to handle more responsibilities around the house, and making a conscious effort to reconnect with me. Some moments felt hopeful, like when we shared a laugh over a silly memory or had a genuine conversation about something other than the affair. But other moments were harder. There were times when I'd catch her looking at her phone and feel a pang of suspicion, even though she'd promised she was done with Tyler. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Emily seemed distant, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked, pausing the movie. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. As much as I wanted to move forward, part of me couldn't let go of the past. The memories of her betrayal were like a shadow, always lurking in the background. And no matter how much progress we made, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. Trusting her again felt like walking on a tightrope, unsure if the next step would hold, or if everything would come crashing down. For a while, I tried to convince myself that things were getting better. Emily was doing everything she could to show she was committed: therapy sessions, open communication, and constant reassurances. But the shadow of doubt never fully left me, and as much as I wanted to believe her, I couldn't ignore the little voice in my head that kept whispering, "Something still isn't right." The turning point came one Thursday evening. Emily had mentioned earlier in the week that she'd be working late on a big project, and while the excuse was reasonable, it didn't sit well with me. Her tone was too casual, too rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for me to question her. That night, I sat at home, trying to distract myself with work, but my mind kept wandering back to her. Around 9 p.m., I texted her to see how things were going. "Still at the office," she replied. "Just finishing up. Shouldn't be much longer." Her response should have reassured me, but it didn't. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. On impulse, I opened the tracking app on my phone, the same one I'd used weeks ago to find her at the restaurant with Tyler. Her location wasn't at her office. The app showed her at a bar downtown, one I recognized as the same place Tyler had taken her before. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, the truth hitting me like a freight train. She'd promised me it was over, that she'd cut all ties with him. But here she was, breaking that promise without a second thought. I grabbed my keys and drove to the bar, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Part of me hoped the app was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation for why she was there. But deep down, I already knew what I'd find. When I arrived, I parked across the street and walked in. The place was dimly lit, loud with the hum of conversations and clinking glasses. My eyes scanned the room, and then I saw her. Emily was sitting at a corner table with Tyler, her body angled toward him as they talked. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sight of them together made my blood boil. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I stood there for a moment, watching as my worst fears were confirmed. She wasn't just lying to me, she was actively choosing him over me, even after everything we'd been through. Finally, I walked over to their table. Emily's laughter froze the second she saw me. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Jason," she stammered, pulling her hand away from Tyler's arm. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice cold and steady. "But I think we both know the answer." Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking like he wanted to disappear. "I should probably go," he muttered, standing up. "No," I said sharply, glaring at him. "You stay. I want you to hear this too." Emily opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't bother lying, Emily. I tracked your location. You told me you were at work, and here you are, again, with him." Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. "It's not what it looks like. I swear, Jason, we were just talking." "Talking?" I scoffed. "Do you think I'm that stupid? You promised me it was over. You begged me to give you another chance, and this is how you repay me?" Tyler mumbled something about leaving again, but I ignored him. My focus was entirely on Emily. "I trusted you," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "I gave you the benefit of the doubt, even when every instinct told me not to. And you've done nothing but prove me wrong." Emily broke down, sobbing into her hands, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. "Not this time. This is it," I said, my voice firm. "We're done, Emily. I can't do this anymore. I deserve better than this, better than you." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the bar, leaving her and Tyler behind. The weight of my decision hit me the second I stepped outside, but instead of regret, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do. There was no going back now. In the days following my confrontation with Emily at the bar, I began taking steps to dismantle the life we had built together. It was painful, like tearing down a house I had spent years constructing, but it was necessary. The first thing I did was contact a divorce attorney. The word itself felt heavy on my tongue, a stark reminder of how far things had fallen apart. I explained the situation to the lawyer: a marriage of 12 years, an affair, a broken promise of reconciliation. He listened carefully and assured me that we'd handle everything step by step. That same day, I packed a bag and left the house. Staying there felt unbearable, like living in the ghost of a life that no longer existed. I moved into a small furnished apartment across town, the kind of place meant for a fresh start. It wasn't home, but at least it was mine. Emily tried calling and texting me, but I ignored her. Her messages ranged from desperate apologies to pleas for a conversation. "Jason, please, can we talk? I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't throw everything away. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you to reconsider. You mean everything to me. Please, just one more chance." But her words meant nothing now. She'd made her choices, and so had I. When I finally told her about the divorce, her response was a mix of shock and heartbreak. She called me, sobbing into the phone. "Jason, please don't do this. We can still fix this. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever you want." "I wanted that before," I said coldly. "And you threw it away. This is on you, Emily." Her crying grew louder, but I ended the call before I could say something crueler. The truth was, I didn't have the energy for her tears anymore. As word of our separation spread among our friends and family, the reactions were mixed. My close friends were supportive, rallying around me with words of encouragement and offers to help in any way they could. "You're doing the right thing," my best friend, Greg, told me over a beer one night. "She betrayed you, man. You don't come back from that." But not everyone was on my side. Emily's family, who had always been close to us, seemed to blame me for not trying harder to salvage the marriage. Her mother called me once, accusing me of giving up too easily. "Marriage is about forgiveness, Jason," she said, her tone sharp. "Everyone makes mistakes. Don't you think you owe it to Emily to try?" "No," I replied firmly. "I did try." And she threw it back in my face. "This isn't about a mistake, it's about a pattern of betrayal." That shut her up, but the conversation left a bitter taste in my mouth. As for Emily, the fallout from her actions wasn't limited to our marriage. Her affair with Tyler had become public knowledge, thanks to a mutual friend who'd spotted them together and spread the news. It wasn't long before whispers turned into full-blown gossip, and soon, her coworkers and social circle were all talking about it. She called me one day, her voice full of despair. "Everyone knows, Jason," she said. "People are treating me differently. I feel like I can't show my face at work anymore." I didn't respond. What could I say? She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. In the midst of all this chaos, I focused on myself for the first time in years. I started going to the gym again, something I'd neglected during the later years of our marriage. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I'd long since abandoned, and even began seeing a therapist on my own to work through the emotional scars left by the betrayal. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, and I found myself replaying the good memories of our marriage, wondering where it had all gone wrong. But with time, those moments grew fewer and farther between. Emily and I still had to communicate occasionally, mostly to sort out the logistics of the divorce. Each conversation was tense and painful, a reminder of everything we'd lost. But with every email, phone call, and signed document, I felt myself moving closer to closure. The life I'd known was over, but I was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, a better one was waiting for me on the other side. After the divorce papers were filed, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, mourning the end of a life I'd spent over a decade building with Emily. But there was also relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again, free from the suffocating weight of mistrust and betrayal. The first step in rebuilding my life was focusing on myself. I'd spent so much of my energy trying to figure out what went wrong in my marriage that I'd forgotten who I was outside of it. I started going to the gym regularly, finding solace in the physical release of exercise. It wasn't just about getting in shape, it was about reclaiming control over something, anything, in my life. I also threw myself into my work. Graphic design had always been my passion, but during the rocky years of my marriage, it had become more of a routine than a joy. Now, I found myself experimenting with new techniques, taking on creative projects I'd never had the confidence to try before. For the first time in a long time, I felt inspired. Friends became another lifeline. I reconnected with Greg and a few others I'd lost touch with over the years, realizing how much I'd isolated myself during my marriage. They dragged me out of the house on weekends, convincing me to join them for drinks, hikes, and even the occasional concert. "You need this, man," Greg said one night as we sat in a bar, nursing beers. "You've been through hell, but you're coming out the other side. You should be proud of that." I wasn't sure if proud was the right word, but I did feel stronger. Therapy also played a big role in my healing. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Ellis, helped me unpack the emotional baggage I'd been carrying. She pushed me to look beyond the anger and sadness, to examine what I could learn from the experience. "It's easy to focus on the betrayal," she told me during one session. "But what about you? What do you want your life to look like moving forward? Who do you want to be?" That question stuck with me. For so long, my identity had been tied to being Emily's husband. Now, I had to figure out who I was without her. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself rediscovering old passions. I dusted off my camera and started taking photographs again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago. I spent weekends hiking through trails, capturing shots of sunrises, wildlife, and quiet, serene landscapes. Through it all, I began to feel lighter. The memories of Emily and Tyler still haunted me at times, but they no longer consumed me. The bitterness I'd carried in the immediate aftermath of the affair started to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of optimism. One day, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post from Emily. It was a photo of her sitting alone in a cafe, accompanied by a caption about self-reflection and second chances. I didn't feel anger or sadness when I saw it, just a quiet sense of finality. Her life was her own now, just as mine was mine. As I stood on my balcony that evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I realized that I was finally starting to feel at peace. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. And that, more than anything else, gave me hope for the future. With the divorce finalized and the dust of my old life settling, I found myself standing on the edge of something new. The freedom I'd gained was both exhilarating and terrifying. For years, I'd been tethered to the idea of us, and now, for the first time in over a decade, it was just me. My days started to take on a new rhythm. I'd wake up early, hit the gym, and spend my afternoons working on client projects or exploring creative ideas. The solitude that had once felt heavy and oppressive was beginning to feel like a gift, a chance to reconnect with myself. One weekend, I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. I booked a small cabin near a lake, packed my camera and hiking gear, and drove up early on a Friday morning. The fresh air and quiet were exactly what I needed. For 3 days, I hiked, photographed breathtaking landscapes, and let the serenity of nature wash over me. On the last evening of the trip, as I sat by the lake watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Life hadn't gone the way I'd planned, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the detours were just as important as the destinations. Back in the city, I began stepping out of my comfort zone more often. I attended meetups for creative professionals, joined a photography club, and even took a cooking class. Meeting new people was daunting at first, but it reminded me that the world was so much bigger than the bubble I'd been living in. It was during one of those photography meetups that I met someone new, a woman named Claire. She was a freelance writer with a passion for travel, and we struck up a conversation about the places we'd been and the ones we still dreamed of visiting. At first, it was just casual. We'd exchange messages about photography tips or share recommendations for hiking trails. But as the weeks went on, our conversations grew deeper. She had an easy way of making me laugh, and her curiosity about the world was infectious. One evening, after a group outing, Claire and I lingered at the cafe long after everyone else had left. She asked about my life, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself opening up, about the divorce, the betrayal, and the journey I'd been on since. "I'm sorry you went through that," she said, her eyes filled with genuine empathy. "But it sounds like you've come a long way." "I think I have," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. We spent hours talking that night, and by the time I walked her to her car, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for the possibility of a new relationship, but for the life I was building for myself. Over the next few months, Claire and I grew closer. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, neither of us was in a rush, but it was refreshing and honest. She respected my boundaries and gave me the space to heal, while also encouraging me to step forward into this new chapter of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. My past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. There was still so much life to live, and I was determined to make the most of it. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. A year ago, I was a man whose life felt like it was crumbling, drowning in betrayal and heartbreak. Today, I feel stronger, wiser, and more at peace than I ever thought possible. There were days when I thought I'd never recover, moments when the pain felt too overwhelming to bear. But if this journey has taught me anything, it's that we are capable of far more resilience than we realize. When Emily's affair came to light, I was consumed by anger and sadness. I wanted answers, explanations, something to make sense of the senseless. But what I've come to understand is that sometimes you won't get the answers you're looking for, and that's okay. People make choices, and those choices have consequences. Emily's choices shattered the trust we'd built over 12 years, but they also forced me to take a hard look at my own life. I had to confront the parts of myself I'd neglected, the dreams I'd put on hold, and the ways I'd let our relationship define me. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. For a long time, I held on to my anger like a shield, afraid that letting it go would mean letting her off the hook. But I've learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone else's behavior, it's about freeing yourself from the weight of their actions. Letting go of that anger allowed me to focus on what truly mattered, healing and moving forward. My time in therapy taught me a lot about relationships, trust, and communication. I've come to see how important it is to nurture a partnership continuously, to never take the other person, or yourself, for granted. Relationships require effort, honesty, and a willingness to confront problems head-on, even when it's uncomfortable. As for Emily, I don't harbor ill will toward her anymore. I hope she's found clarity in her own life and is working through her struggles. Our paths have diverged, and that's okay. Some people are meant to be part of your story for a chapter, not the whole book. Meeting Claire has been a blessing, but more importantly, rebuilding my sense of self has been the real victory. I've learned to enjoy my own company, to appreciate the quiet moments of solitude, and to value the relationships that truly enrich my life. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this: give yourself permission to grieve, to feel, and to heal. Don't rush the process or force yourself to move on before you're ready. And when you're ready, don't be afraid to take that first step forward, even if it feels small or uncertain. Life doesn't always go according to plan, but sometimes the detours lead you to places you never expected. Standing here now, with the weight of the past behind me and a future full of possibilities ahead, I can say with certainty that I've found peace. And for me, that's enough.